นะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนะมัสสามิ Blessings, good evening. One of the questions that people are always asking monks is, can lay people become enlightened? So the simple answer that the Buddha gave is yes, but with conditions. You have to fulfill the conditions of the practice, complete, as it were, the Noble Eightfold Path, cultivate it to perfection, to completion. Whether you're a monk, nun, layman, lay woman, that's the requirement for enlightenment. And the Buddha actually said he wouldn't enter parinibbana, meaning he wouldn't die until he'd established the four companies of Buddhists, that is, Sangha, monks, nuns, laymen, laywomen. So that, and not just establish them, but also establish them with people becoming enlightened. As we know, there's four stages of enlightenment: there's stream, enterer, once returner, non-returner, and arahant, enlightened being. This is our vehicle for the practice, and the Buddha said he wouldn't leave, wouldn't die until it was done. And 3 months before he entered parinibbana, passed away, he told Venerable Ananda, his attendant, that in 3 months' time I will die. But as the story goes, there was the chance for Venerable Ananda to, if he was sharp enough, quick enough, to say, "Oh, please stay on for the benefit of everyone." But he didn't say that. So the Buddha didn't stay on. He did follow his own prediction and died 3 months later. Nevertheless, his teachings have survived, and there's still this vehicle for enlightenment, to bring unenlightened human beings to a place where they're beyond suffering. There's many words for this enlightenment, this awakening, nibbana, the deathless, the unborn, the uncreated, the unconditioned, and so on. And all these words are pointing to the same thing, which is, you could say, part of nature. And people always ask, the next question after, can lay people get enlightened, is what is enlightenment? Is it a place, a state? What is it? And sometimes they answer, well, it's just part of nature. The enlightened or the awakened mind is a mind that is without clinging, without attachment, without suffering. So there is that part of nature that is without suffering. That's the mind without attachment, without delusion. So it isn't a person or a being, it's just part of nature, just as everything else is part of nature. There's the physical world, and then there's the mental world. These are parts of nature, and they follow laws of nature. One of them is Dhamma niyama, the law of Dhamma or law of truth. So Dhamma niyama means things like a thought rooted in greed will always lead to suffering. A thought rooted in anger will always lead to suffering. A thought rooted in delusion will always lead to suffering. It's just a law of nature. Similarly, a thought rooted in non-greed, so letting go, renunciation, generosity, will be a cause for happiness. A thought rooted in non-anger, so kindness, compassion, will be a cause for happiness. A thought rooted in non-delusion, so mindfulness and wisdom, will be a cause for happiness. The unenlightened mind always takes it one step further immediately and says, well, who's happy, who's suffering? That's me, I am happy, I am suffering. So my greed, my anger, my delusion, my kindness, my mindfulness, my insight, the sense of my straight away comes up in the unenlightened mind. A sense of self grasps, even the good things, even the good thoughts. But the Buddha, having practiced and seen through the delusion of self, said, no, this is just nature. We have what we call the mental defilements, the causes of suffering on one side, greed, anger and delusion. And then the path that leads to the end of suffering on the other side, the practice of Dhamma, non-greed, non-anger, non-delusion. But there's no person or being owning either of these two sides. They're just parts of nature that do their thing, just follow their way. So a thought of greed will always, we say, defile the mind, darken the mind, increase the feeling of, or the experience of suffering, increases attachment which leads to suffering. That's just nature, it's the way it is. So there's no one to blame for all of that. There's no one to sort of pin the blame on and say, oh, it's their fault, or even yourself, my fault. It's just the way it is in nature. Greed or selfishness leads to suffering, anger leads to suffering. It's just the way it is. But our delusion immediately creates a self. I am greedy, so I am suffering. I am angry, I am suffering. Or I am kind, I am happy, I am mindful. Even mindfulness we can attach to with a sense of self. Even Nibbana can be attached to it with a sense of self. Obviously not the actual experience of Nibbana, but the idea of Nibbana, awakening, enlightenment, can become a basis of attachment. And people do this sometimes. They have a good experience in their meditation. They seem to understand many things. They're very peaceful, bright, happy. And they can have the thought, oh, this must be enlightenment. Maybe this is Nibbana. So then they believe they've reached Nibbana when perhaps they haven't. Often it's because they've had a strong desire for Nibbana. But a desire mixed up with the sense of self, or even a greed for Nibbana, for the result of the practice. It's another kind of an attachment. So sometimes this can be depressing, because it's like everywhere you turn, it seems like there's a mental defilement, there's a desire, there's attachment. We have no choice but to press on and keep practicing. So the Buddha compared the practice to like cutting a pathway through the jungle. There's trees and bushes and vines and creepers and all kinds of things all over the place. And it's hard work to cut a path through virgin jungle that's never been cleared before. It's tiring. You know, if you've ever done that, if you ever made a path through the jungle, you get bugs on you and leeches and spiders, and you trip over things and you tread on thorns and bash your knee or whatever. You know, it's not easy and it's not painless. That's like the practice of Dhamma. Of course, the goal is Nibbana. It's like getting through to the other side of the jungle. But while you're doing it, it's hard work. So we often feel a bit depressed or like giving up because it is such hard work. But we really have no choice, because you either do it now or you put it off and keep suffering, and then you will have to do it at a later stage. Sometimes we flatter ourselves as human beings. We kind of take the edge off our suffering and talk about our achievements as human beings. So unenlightened people are still able to achieve many things, you know, in science, medicine, economy, exploration, inventions, knowledge, art, literature, all kinds of things, which, you know, they're all good in themselves, but they're not the same as Nibbana. They don't get human beings beyond suffering. They maybe ease the pain, make us feel a bit better for a while, but they don't remove mental defilements from the human mind, really. When I was a young monk, teachers would often joke, they say, oh, nowadays humans, we've learnt to build rockets and we can travel to the moon, which, you know, was an amazing thing when it first happened. But we can travel to the moon, but we can't free our mind from anger. So, you know, who went to the moon? If we're honest, probably unenlightened human beings went to the moon. They come back unenlightened. They're still suffering. They still get stressed, worried, angry, get attached to things. So the worldly achievements that human beings can do, they're not to be belittled or looked down on, but they're just not comparable to Nibbana, the end of suffering. And yet we spend all this time pursuing the more ordinary kinds of success, achievements, happiness, and we neglect Nibbana. If we're honest, you know, even Buddhists will neglect Nibbana. We have the view, oh, I've read the book, I know all about that, and what's next? And because we know the words and heard a bit, read a bit, then we tend to feel we don't need to practice ourselves, because we know. You know, we go and listen to a monk or some teacher and we feel we know, but that's just the words, isn't it? We haven't actually purified our heart from these defilements. And these mental defilements, there's a lot of them. We talk about the 108 kinds of craving. It's already a lot, plenty to deal with. That's craving based on sense contact. So the Buddha said we've got 6 senses: eyes, ears, nose, tongue, the skin, which gives us touch, and then the mind itself. So 6 senses, and you get pleasant and unpleasant objects come into your 6 senses, which gives you feelings, how you feel about what you see, whether it's pleasant, neutral or unpleasant. That's 3 kinds of feeling. So 3 times 6 is already 18. And you've got internal and external, and you've got physical and mental. You keep multiplying it, you end up with 108 different kinds of craving based on the feeling that you have through your senses. then they talk about the 1,500 kinds of mental defilements. Expand it further, all the different defilements you can experience based on, rooted in greed, anger and delusion that arises when we have sense contact. But all the offshoots, it's endless. You've got the 5 khandhas, this body and mind, the Buddha split up into 5 khandhas, different kinds of attachment to them, coarse and refined, superior, inferior, internal, external. It's endless. You've got 1,500 mental defilements to deal with. So often we do get discouraged. It seems like there's one thing after another. Everyone knows that feeling. Oh, it's just one problem after another. If you're meditating, you've got the 5 hindrances, another way of describing these mental defilements, one after another. Sense desire, ill will, drowsiness, anxiety and worry, doubt, constantly popping up into your mind. So it seems endless. But at least we have a remedy for them. At least we have the teachings of the Buddha, which gives us a way through the jungle of the mind, through to the clarity and the peace and the happiness of the Dhamma. Which he compared to like an ancient city. Cutting through the jungle, you get to the ancient city. That's like the mind that goes still and has the clarity that understands, defilement is defilement, should be abandoned because it defiles the mind, whether it's greed, anger or delusion. It's the nature of defilement to defile the mind, so it should be abandoned. There's no, you don't have to feel bad that you have some greed or anger. You don't have to feel guilty or sad. But to recognize defilement defiles the mind. It darkens, blemishes the mind. There's actually no person involved there. It's just the function or the duty of defilements. That's what they do. Whenever you let greed into your mind, it will defile your mind, so it will lead to some suffering, some unhappiness. That's what defilements do. Whereas when you practice the Dhamma, cultivate the Eightfold Path, that has the nature or the function or the role to help you reduce and abandon defilement. Again, there's no person involved there, it's just qualities of nature, aspects of nature that we cultivate. So when there's mindfulness, the opposite of mindfulness is delusion, confusion, can't exist when there's a moment of mindfulness. Actually, there's no real person there doing that, although we do, for convenience sake, we use language and say, I practice mindfulness. What we're really doing is cultivating the quality of mindfulness, using a technique such as the breath, comes up, but there's no person in there. Mindfulness is not a person or a being. We say it's not self. It's a very good, useful quality of mind. It's a wholesome quality of mind, but it's not a self. The opposite of mindfulness, delusion, confusion, all the different kinds of suffering, that's also not self, but they're to be abandoned because they cause us suffering. They bring up the experience of suffering. Suffering is not self. Mental defilements are not self. Suffering is not self. So the mind of the Arahant, one who reaches Nibbana, they don't see suffering or defilements as self. They don't stress about them. They just know them for what they are. Oh, anger is like that. It brings you mental pain, darkens the mind, brings you to unhappiness, therefore let it go. Greed, attachment, lust bring you a different kind of suffering, but it also should be let go of. But they don't create a self out of the defilements. They just know a defilement is like that. That's what it does. It's just like you walk into the forest if you touch certain plants, and they have, needles or thorns, or they maybe even itchy or poisonous. That's just what they do, so you stay away from them. But it's not, there's a person there, it's not like that leaf with a bit of poison or some thorns or needles on it. It's like a person waiting to get you. You might think that when you're in the forest and you brush against that leaf, you think, oh, who did that? You're looking around for someone to blame. But it's just nature, isn't it? Some leaves are poisonous. Some leaves are poisonous if you eat them, if you touch them. Just like mushrooms. At this time of year you get all the mushrooms coming up. Some of them are deadly if you eat them. It's not like there's a person who does that. That's just what the nature of those chemicals and those substances in those mushrooms do. So you stay away from them. Mental defilements darken your mind and make you feel suffering. Mental suffering, and may even make bad karma, which brings back both physical and mental suffering. So you stay away from mental defilements. But to stay away from them, you've got to see them. And that's the practice of the meditator or the Buddhist practitioner. You're learning to recognize where suffering comes from. To do that, you train your mind. Just as someone going into the forest, like the indigenous people that go into the forest, they know all the roots, the herbs, the good ones, the poisonous ones, the ones that you can eat, the ones that are good for medicine. They know them because they've learned. We have to do the same with the jungle of our mind and learn where the suffering comes from and leave them alone. You don't pick up that angry thought, don't hold on to it, don't cling to it, let it go. Don't pick up the jealousy, the worry, the fear. Have enough awareness and clarity and develop the skill of insight to say, oh, this is the cause of suffering, let it go. We have to study the jungle of the mind just as people who are skilled in the forest and the jungle have to learn all the plants. But there's no person there. That's why the Buddha kept bringing us back to develop insight into not self. Because our default mode, our habit is to grasp at things as self immediately. As soon as you have a thought, this is me, mine. So the teaching on not self is to counter that habit, to help us loosen the attachment. Ajahn Chah used to compare it to a screw or a bolt that you screw in, say, to wood or metal. You tighten it and then it becomes firm, tightly screwed into the wood or the metal. That's like the sense of self that's built up so many times for so long. Insight into not self is like untying that, or loosening it, unbinding it, unwinding it, unscrewing it. So the teaching on not self is like a really good screwdriver or spanner or whatever it is that you can grab the screw and loosen it, pull it out. Before you grab the screw, you've got to grab it tightly before you can turn it. If you ever try to unscrew something, sometimes if you don't grab it tightly enough, it won't move. It's not because it can't move, it's because you haven't grabbed it tightly enough. It's like someone who hasn't got enough mindfulness to see and recollect not self. So they grasp at it in the old way, that feeling, that thought, that perception. What you have to say is, the screwdriver or the pliers or the spanner is not, you're not using it properly yet. You have to really firmly grasp that screw to get it out. You have to bring up the mindfulness, you have to do your mindfulness practice so you can know your mind and loosen it from its attachment to those mental states, those thoughts, those emotions that cause you suffering, what we call mental defilements. If you think about it, if you learn to use a screwdriver or a spanner, well, in the course of your life you might actually uproot thousands of screws, bolts, unbolt, unscrew, many things. Even if you're not a professional, you're just an amateur, you might still do many, many jobs. So then 1,500 mental defilements doesn't sound so bad or so impossible. Or 108 kinds of craving doesn't sound so impossible. If you just meditate 15 minutes a day for 100 days, that's a lot of mindfulness you're bringing up. If you do it for 10 or 20 or 30 years, then your mindfulness is really going to improve. And of course, if you do more, even more so. If you go on a retreat and you do 10 days of mindfulness practice, even though you have plenty of moments where you lose your mindfulness, there'll be plenty of moments when you are mindful. You might start to understand or see what the Buddha was pointing to. You realize, maybe if you're just mindful enough, you can quite easily let go of many things. Most people go on retreat, by the end they feel a lot lighter, more relaxed, more at peace than when they started. That lightness comes because they've been letting go. It's bringing up mindfulness and letting go of different attachments through the retreat. It's the characteristic of the Dhamma. The Dhamma is light in weight, soft light, and then light in light, as in bright, luminous. So the more we practice mindfulness and investigate our mind and the cause of suffering, it's like the mind becomes brighter and we see more clearly why we get stressed. Then we can let go. If you've been in the world a few years, you can probably already think back to a time when you had big stress, big suffering maybe, to do with a relationship or a health issue, a money issue, work, job, family, whatever. There will have been some time probably where you can remember back and say, oh, at that time I was really stressed, full of worry, anxiety, full of anger, really upset, or just so attached, obsessed with something that I couldn't let go. But now, all these years later, you realize, oh, I did let go, it's past, it's over. So you can see that was not self. If it was self, it would still be right here with you right now, that same feeling, that same experience of stress, suffering. But if it's not, that just proves you it's not self, it's not you. That's showing you that you can let go of things that you attach to as self. And you're better off for it, aren't you? But we have to keep looking, keep investigating, otherwise we keep making the same old mistake. Picking things up and clinging so tightly that this sense of self forms, and then when things don't go our way, or the pleasure, the happiness fades, then we start to get disappointed because we have this attachment and this sense of self. Any pleasure that you attach to will hurt you after because it fades, it changes, and then you miss it, or you want it back, or you're disappointed that you lost it. That's why we investigate and develop insight into not self, because if you can see the pleasure is not self, then you may still have the pleasure, but you don't attach to it. So then you don't suffer when it changes or it passes. A lot of those 108 kinds of craving are based around desire for pleasure, attachment to pleasure, and then the suffering when the pleasure goes or we don't get it back again. If you have enough mindfulness and maintain the recollection of not self, you experience the pleasure, but you know this is not self. This will not last, this is not self. Even before the pleasure, you know, this pleasure that I'm about to experience won't last, and it's not self, I can't have it forever. That's mindfulness, isn't it? Non-delusion. You know, pleasure is like that, it brings you a certain feeling, you can see the potential for attachment, but it's just like that. It arises, passes away, it's not self. The fact that it passes away, there's no one to blame for that. It's just the nature of things. It's the way it is. If you can't get the pleasure back again for whatever reason, that's just the way it is. It's just the way things are. Sometimes the causes and conditions are not right. That pleasure can't be had. But it's not self. If you can see that, then you don't suffer. You do that when you're meditating on the breath, say, you're letting go of all kinds of attachment. There's other things you could be doing, but you're letting go of those desires. There's thoughts, feelings, emotions that come up into your experience, but you see them, you know them, and you let go of that sense of self. And then you get a higher or more deeper kind of peace. And letting go of self isn't leading to some kind of loss, or doesn't make you worse off, it makes you better off, because you get a deeper, more profound kind of peace. That's why the Buddha taught it. He's only teaching out of compassion, helping us to be more at ease, more peaceful within ourselves. Maybe one day we'll all have the ability to get in a rocket and go to the moon, go to Mars. But don't forget, when you get there, it's still going to be a case of the moon is not self, the pleasure of getting there, achieving that is not self. It arises, passes away. You come back to earth and everything is still as it is. It's just Dhamma Niyama, just the law of Dhamma. If you attach to going to the moon, you're going to suffer. Or maybe one day it will be Mars or some other place. That's the nature of the world. It's impermanent, unsatisfactory, not self. If you can see that, then you're letting go of suffering, the causes of suffering. So anyway, I'll leave you with those reflections tonight, and can always talk again next time.